excited to have Dr. Mia Brantley Wright with us. Known to us as Mia, she is a disciple in our sister church in South Carolina. She is currently a postdoctoral scholar in the Department of Sociology at The Ohio State University. So she's actually making a transition to Ohio at some point, but she currently lives in South Carolina. She is a trained sociologist, and her academic scholarship lies at the intersection of race, gender, and family within the context of health. Mia looks to provide exploration and insight into the multiple ways racism and race-related stress impacts the health and lived experiences of racially marginalized communities. Her work aims to provide intellectual discourse, tools, and resources to address racial inequalities in the United States. In addition to her academic work and her work helping churches all around, she also speaks at several organizations within the US. So I want to welcome Mia. Mia actually has been a great support to the SCUAD here. Before we even started our SCUAD, Mia was one of the people that we reached out to ask for help, because she is on the ICOC SCUAD, which is the SCUAD that oversees the rest of all of our churches. But she is also part of her SCUAD in South Carolina. So she has been a great support to help us learn about how to form a SCUAD and what are some of the things that we ought to be thinking about when we're, making programs and looking at programs for the church. So she's a friend of the SCUAD here, and we know you guys are in for a treat. So we just want to say welcome, Mia. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, everyone. As a true sociologist and academic, I cannot do anything without a PowerPoint. So I am going to share my screen with you all, and then we can go ahead and get started. Okay, we should be good to go. So as Desreen mentioned, my name is Mia Brantley Wright. I'm a researcher and teacher. I earned my PhD in sociology, where, as she mentioned, my research is at the intersection of race, gender, and family within the larger context of health. I'm also a member of the Columbia Church here in Columbia, South Carolina, which really allows me to bring a Christian perspective and framing to the work that I do. So I've been invited, as Desiree mentioned, to several organizations, businesses, churches, where I'm asked to teach and lead workshops very similarly to the one that we're doing here today. So I just want to say again, I'm so grateful for the leadership of the Capitol Rivers Church inviting me out here virtually, and really just grateful for the opportunity to be able to hold this space for you all. And I also want to thank each of you for deciding to spend your morning/afternoon with me today. So I'm looking forward to the conversations that are going to diverge from this workshop. So for today's workshop, we really have 4 sort of broad learning objectives. So the first, we're going to be defining terms and concepts that are related and surrounding implicit bias. So we're also going to be discussing bias-related processes. We're going to make efforts in understanding the impact of implicit bias. And then we're also going to be recognizing the importance of these concepts from a biblical perspective. And so as Ilse mentioned, as we go through this workshop, we may encounter topics or feelings that kind of make us feel uneasy, right? Feel a little bit uncomfortable. And I really want to welcome everyone to embrace those feelings, embrace those times of discomfort. Recognizing and embracing the emotions that occur during a workshop like this is really what's imperative to learning and growing, right? And so while I am encouraging for this to be a co-learning environment, right, meaning we're all learning from each other, learning from our different perspectives, learning from our stories, I really like to set what I call communal agreements, just to ensure that we're able to reach the objectives that we set out to today. So I have 4 communal agreements as we're sharing this space today. So the first is going to be respect, right? So respect for myself, of course, but also respect for everyone that is here with us today. So when people share, when people have questions, that we just make sure that we're showing everyone the proper respect during those times. I also ask that we speak in I statements. Speaking from our own perspectives, I think, I believe. That's really what's going to be what is helping us connect to the material that we learned today. So it can be really easy, especially once we come back from our discussion groups. We want to say, we think, or well, we thought, but I really encourage us to speak from our own perspectives because, one, it helps you individually connect with the things that you're learning, but it also helps others in this space connect with you as well. I ask that when you hear one voice, that all ears are listening, right? So it can be easy to, kind of be thinking about the next thing, wanting to jump in and say something. And especially virtually, we can have a lot of distractions around us. But I really ask that when we hear one voice speaking, whether that's in your discussion groups or in our larger community space, that we're just really working to make sure that we're listening to the person that's speaking. And then last but certainly not least, confidentiality, right? I ask that everything that is shared today, once again, whether your discussion groups or within this larger workshop, just remain confidential, right? And what really helps us with this is going back to speaking in those I statements, right? Not sharing what other people have stated or what other people felt, but sharing, if you want to share what you learned, share what you felt during the workshop, right? But just maintaining the confidentiality of all those here so that we can continue to maintain this safe space for everyone. And so with that being said, this workshop really thrives on participation from you all because that's how we learn from one another, right? We learn from our stories, our perspectives. And so we want to make sure that we're maintaining these agreements throughout our 3 hours together during that process. So with that being said, when I ask a question, please feel free to use the raise your hand command within Zoom. And once you hear your name called, feel free to unmute yourself and we can start that conversation. And that way we can really ensure that everyone feels heard and, potentially has a chance to speak and share. So with that being said, I want to start with a little icebreaker. So a few of you have been to one of my workshops before, so I know that this will be familiar to you, right? But we're going to start out with a little icebreaker. So a father and a son were involved in a car accident in which the father was killed and the son was seriously injured. The father was pronounced dead at the scene of the accident and his body was taken to a local morgue. The son was taken by ambulance to a nearby hospital and was immediately wheeled into an emergency operating room. A surgeon was called, and upon arrival and seeing the patient, the attending surgeon exclaimed, "Oh my God, it's my son." So can someone explain this? We'll take a couple of minutes and then we'll let I think Lily had her hand raised.
Because the surgeon is the mom. She's a mother.
Yeah, the surgeon is the mother. That's exactly right. Did anyone else have a different thought? You can raise your hand.
See, Steve's hand is up, Mia.
Oh yes, Steve, go ahead.
Oh no, I'd heard it before. I knew the answer. I didn't take my hand down, but I knew the surgeon
Okay.
was the mother. So But
Okay.
I think what you're getting at is just the sexism of the profession.
Is
That a
that what I'm
surgeon,
getting
I think so. Yeah.
at? What about you, Doug?
So I'm used to the former question where the surgeon is the mother,
Hmm.
but in today's society, there can be same gender parents on both sides. So as someone's saying right now, it could be a gay married couple, and so it could be a man in this case as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Grace, you have your hand raised. So someone mentioned it could be a same-sex couple.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. I was thinking it might have been a same-sex couple.
And I was thinking, I'm next to Grace, and I was thinking it was just a blended family. Maybe it's one of them is mother, father, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's pronounced, is it Blitz? Blitz?
Blitz, yeah, Kiersey.
Blitz, okay.
Yeah, I am so embarrassed because my husband and I talk about how we're partners, and I immediately thought the surgeon was a man and dismissed it.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Absolutely. And totally no need to be embarrassed, right? But that's absolutely I think that's something else that we commonly hear. I want to make sure that I got all the hands. Yes. So what this does is it really reveals a lot of the hidden assumptions, largely unconscious, right, surrounding gender. So we know consciously that women can totally be um, be surgeons, but there's a little bit of bias, which we'll talk about in a minute, where it's hard for us to connect sometimes these powerful positions such as surgeons, or we can think of others being also synonymous with female, right, with women. And so whenever I present this, whether, at a workshop, and I'm talking CEOs, I'm talking teachers, even within college classrooms, I would say out of a class of 100 students, I'll have probably 40 who will tell me, yeah, professor, I did not think at all that it was a woman. Like, it never crossed my mind that it was the boy's mom. Um, Usually common answers that I hear will be, oh, it was the stepfather, right? Like someone shared. I've heard the uncle, which, I don't know. But, right. Or I've heard, it's the grandfather, the boy's real father, right? So maybe the boy was adopted, all of these sorts of things. And so what this is also highlighting, in addition to these kind of hidden assumptions, it's really highlighting the power of language, right? So language is reflective of our larger worldviews, whether conscious or not. And so when we think about the way that we interpret certain words and the meanings behind them, right? When we hear surgeon, our mind goes to man, right? What does that mean? And how is that related to our larger conversation around bias? And what sort of impact can that have over time? So what we're going to do is we're going to jump in and we're going to answer the first part of that question. So what is implicit bias? What do we mean when we talk about this? So I'm going to start out. I'm going to give a couple of dictionary definitions, right? Standard Merriam-Webster. And then I'm going to dive a little bit into the sociological definitions, right? So what we've found based on research. So when thinking of bias, Merriam-Webster defines this as a tendency to believe that some people, ideas, etc., are better than others. And that usually results in treating some people unfairly. So sociologists, we took that a little bit further. And we define this bias as a tendency, either known or unknown, to prefer one thing over another, which is going to prevent objectivity. And then that lack of objectivity is then what influences our understandings or some sort of outcome in some way. So a term, a concept that is closely related to bias is going to be stereotypes. So our standard dictionary definition defines stereotypes as to believe unfairly that all people or things with a particular characteristic are the same. And as sociologists, we took that a little step further, right? So what we find in sociology is that when people stereotype, what we're finding is this is an oversimplification, a generalization that is often unreliable, and it doesn't recognize individual differences between groups or within groups rather, right? And so, okay, well, that's bias, that's stereotyping. So then how does that relate to implicit bias, right? Which is why we're all here today. So implicit bias is going to be a bias or prejudice that is present, but not consciously held or recognized, right? In sociology and other social sciences, such as psychology and social psychology, what we found is that implicit bias largely is going to involve attitudes or stereotypes that are going to affect our understandings, it's going to affect our actions, and our decision making in an unconscious way, right? So ways that we don't readily recognize. And that lack of consciousness is what makes them very difficult to control. So we tend to think of this as a process, right? We have stereotypes and bias. So these sort of unreliable generalizations about a group. And these unreliable generalizations, this, potentially preference in some ways, then leads to prejudice or has the ability to lead to prejudice, which are these negative attitudes towards an entire category of people. And then that in return is what can lead to discrimination. So that is some sort of action, thinking about the decision making that we just talked about when it comes to implicit biases, where it's the denial of any sort of opportunities or rights, unfair treatment to individuals or groups based on some sort of bias. And so kind of stepping back and thinking about this more broadly, what this process suggests is that someone can hold stereotypes and never have the desire or the ability to discriminate. But no one can discriminate without first holding some sort of bias. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to prepare to jump into our first activity. So if you have something to write with, or a device that you can type on, or if you have a really good memory, I do not, so I would need something to write on. But what I want you to do is I want you to take a moment and I want you to write down the 5 people who you trust the most. So I call this activity the circle of trust. So I want you to write down the 5 people who you trust the most. And we're going to exclude family members. We're going to exclude romantic partners. So not your spouse, or, if you are in a romantic relationship. And so once you write down those 5 people, and some of us might need a little time to think of who those folks are. I want you to think about how they are similar to you in the following ways that I list. And just put a tally by their names if they're similar to you in one of these ways. So when thinking of the 5 people who you trust the most, outside of family and romantic partners, I want you to place a tally by their initial, a check mark, if they are similar to you in gender. Is this person the same gender as you? Place a mark by their name. They are similar to race or ethnicity. right? So are they the same race or ethnicity as you? Are they the same nationality as you? Do they speak the same native language that you do? Are you in the same age cohort? Are you around the same age as the people who you trust the most? About professional or economic background? About education? These people have a similar educational background as you do. About religion? Are all the people that you trust, are they Christian? Are they some other religious faith? And then lastly, sexuality. So is everyone in your circle of trust, are they all similar to you in sexuality? So take a moment and look over your responses, think about them. And as you're looking over them, just want to take a second and remind everyone the communal agreements. So as you're preparing to go into your discussion groups, I just want to remind everyone to please respect one another, to speak in I statements, do your best when you hear one voice. All ears should be listening. And last but not least, work to maintain confidentiality within your group, right? So in order to create that safe space, we want to trust that whatever is shared within the group is going to stay there. And so as you prepare to enter your discussion groups, and I'll put these within the chat, I want you to discuss the following things. Describe the makeup of your inner circle to your group. Talk about what feelings came up, whether positive or negative, during this activity. And then lastly, I want you to discuss how might this activity be related to our larger discussion on implicit bias. So we're going to take a moment, and you all will be designated to your groups. And then I'll put the questions in the chat. I believe everyone is back from the breakout rooms now. And as I was jumping around to everyone's room, it was really great. I didn't get to make it to everyone, but it was really great to hear a lot of the vulnerability that was coming through in those groups, and even being able to experience with you all kind of grappling with the different things that you were learning. Like, what does this mean? You know, what could be the impact of this? Is this bad? Is this good? You know, all of these different things. So there was a lot of really healthy conversation going on. And that's what this workshop is all about, right? So that's always really great. And so it is February, right? We're holding this workshop in February. And so it's important to also kind of recognize, right, that in the month of February, that's also when the United States officially recognizes Black History Month. And so is there anyone, you can put in the chat or you can raise your hand, that knows why Black History Month was created? David?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why it was created was to make sure that ongoing generations remember the contributions of Blacks in this country, and also to counteract the fact that a lot of people don't want us to remember. So it's a concerted effort to make sure that we do know our history, that the country knows our history, as well as to counteract the fact that true history is being repressed in many cases. So those are some of the reasons why I believe Black History Month was started.
Yeah, I could not have said it any better. Um, so, but David is definitely hit the nail on the head, right? So when we're talking about Black History Month, this was kind of the brainchild, so to speak, of Carter G. Woodson. So Carter G. Woodson was a Harvard-trained historian, right? So him along, and he was a Black American historian, right? Where him and several others, they came together as part of an organization and put forth the idea of what originally started as Black History Week, and it was extended to a month, right? And they believed it was important that this, horrific history of Black Americans in the United States, right? So this the legacy of American slavery, things like that, be recognized. But more importantly, they wanted to really celebrate the resiliency, the contributions, and the achievements of Black Americans when it comes to the larger U.S. society, right? Because Black Americans had historically been left out of these spaces and these conversations. A lot of their contributions had kind of been pushed to the side or seen as invisible, right? So they're or inadequate, right? So they haven't had that proper recognition. And so Black History Month is definitely about remembrance, but it's also about recognition and celebration, right? And so while we have seen great societal shifts and improvements in many ways, we still see many trends in the research, as well as personal narratives and stories that I'm sure many of you have shared, that suggest that society is not yet where we dream of it to be, right? And so today we're going to discuss a little bit more about how this may play out in our own lives. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is racial bias. It's funny because whenever I talk about racial bias in lectures and workshops, or especially I always joke with students in my class, whenever I get to my race lecture, I always see these sorts of faces, right? So it's kind of like, oh, we're going to talk about race. What does that mean, right? So going back to what I mentioned in the beginning of the workshop, welcome the discomfort, welcome the feelings of unease. Those are things that we need to learn and to grow. So if you're having some of these feelings, if you kind of initially made this sort of face, that's okay. Embrace that as we continue to move forward. So when we talk about the processes that we've been focusing on, right, related to bias and prejudice and these sorts of things, and we're thinking about this in the context of race, you can start thinking about racial stereotypes or racial biases. And so racial stereotypes or biases are going to be a set of ideas that society has kind of influenced us to believe about different racial groups, right? Very general. And so these are going to be oversimplified generalizations that are often unreliable, right? So when we're looking at them empirically in the research, they're not holding up, right? We don't see these blanket characteristics across entire groups. And they're actually not even recognizing these individual differences, right? So they're seeing these generalizations are seeing racial groups as monolithic versus seeing the difference that is held within them. So then these stereotypes, these biases, then have the ability to lead to racial prejudice, right? Which these are going to be the negative attitudes or feelings towards an entire racial group. And these negative feelings are driven by stereotypes, by biases. And then lastly, we have racial discrimination, right? So this is going to be the denial of opportunities or just some sort of unfair treatment that's based on someone's race. And so we can think of this showing up in two dominant ways, right? So you have individual discrimination, which I think a lot of us, that's more readily visible a lot of the times, right? So that's how I'm treating someone else. Am I treating someone unfairly? Am I treating them the same as everyone else? Am I denying them opportunities? And another way that we see this kind of play out is institutional discrimination. So that's going to refer to how like organizations, businesses, institutions might have policies or might act in particular ways that can negatively affect a particular racial group. And so I think the easiest one to kind of, or the most, I guess, obvious example of that would, be Jim Crow segregation, right? So that would be an instance of institutional discrimination. This is where it was very clear, different water fountains, lack of resources in places that were predominantly Black or different spaces like that, right? When I was teaching last semester, there's a couple of students in the class when I asked, what is an example of institutional discrimination that you can think of? A few of the students shared how there's a place they like to go and, hang out and do college stuff. And they talked about how some of the policies there related to dress code, they were like, I think that falls under institutional discrimination. And I say, how so? And they say, well, it would say things like you can't have braids or like different color hair, or you can't, no sneakers or no, jerseys or things like that. And these things, right, while not, probably not explicitly looking to exclude certain groups, right? If there are more people of a specific group who maybe wears braids or different color hair or jerseys, etc., then that is how a particular racial group may be disproportionately affected, right? And so that's what we think of when we think of discrimination, right? So thinking of it in ways of stereotypes and biases, thinking of it in prejudice, and then lastly, thinking of it within the actual discrimination aspect, some sort of practice. And so a lot of the times, especially kind of in just regular, popular discourse, how we talk and how we kind of hear things in the news, a lot of times we can use these words interchangeably, right? Bias, stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination. And so in order to distinguish between them, how I like to think of it and how I like to teach it is that discrimination is the practical manifestation of prejudice, right? So that is the tangible thing that comes out of racial prejudice. And so when we talk about prejudice, that's going to be an attitude, but discrimination is an action. And so generally, social scientists more generally, and sociologists more specifically, have agreed that the research shows us that we're not necessarily born with biases or with prejudicial attitudes, but rather it's often learned based off of our environments and those who are around us. And sometimes this can be families and friends and things like that, but oftentimes it's just our environment. It's just the other folks that we're around, things that we see and pick up on, maybe not something that we're explicitly taught. And bias and prejudice can also be internalized. And so what we mean by that is it does not always have to be against a group of another race. But when it's internalized, that means that you can hold negative feelings, you can hold biases towards a group in which you belong, right? A racial group in which you belong to. So that's what that looks like when it's internalized as well. So going back to the process that we've been discussing, we have these biases and these stereotypes, right? So racial biases, racial stereotypes that they're these overgeneralizations that do not take account individual differences. And they have the ability to lead to racial prejudice, right? So these negative attitudes towards an entire category of people. And then that has the ability to lead to discrimination, right? So that practical manifestation of racial prejudice. So what we're going to do as we prepare for our next discussion, I want to show a brief video, and then we'll have some questions that you are able to discuss, or some discussion points that you're able to focus on within your groups. So we'll go ahead and watch this brief video. Get it going. Can you hear it?
Let's look at how to measure bias in ourselves and in others. Here's Dolly Chuk from NYU.
We sent emails to real professors in real universities.
They contacted over 6,500 professors at random from 260 American universities.
We sent them an email that looked like it came from a real person asking for a meeting to learn more about the PhD program in that university. But we randomly assigned whether the fictional person sending that email had a name that sounded male or female and sounded white, Chinese, Hispanic, Indian, or Black. What we found that is if you were a white male, you were far more likely to receive a response back than if you were in all those other categories put together as a group.
Some of this could be explicit racism, but it's far more likely that in many cases, these professors are just busy. They can't respond to every email they get, so they kind of let their subconscious decide for them. And that's where their biases come through. Research shows that our racial biases are often more about who we choose to help than who we don't. And we tend to help people who are similar to us. But you aren't 6,500 randomly selected professors. So how can you figure out where you might be making similar unconscious choices? First, there's a well-known test online you can take that can help show you biases you hold. Or
just do an audit. Whatever data you have, whether it's formal data in a computer or whether it's just data that's sort of anecdotal, look at the data. For example, I met this fantastic executive in Silicon Valley. He takes great pride in being someone who actively tries to achieve gender balance on his teams, knowing that Silicon Valley and tech are skewed heavily male.
So he looked at his professional social network, his Twitter, his LinkedIn.
He found his network was far more skewed male than he expected. So there's a place where he could actively work to shift that, and that's what he's been doing since then.
So this is not a scientifically exact self-audit, but it can still be useful, and you can audit anything. So maybe start by taking that online test for bias. Maybe check out whose emails you're replying to. But you can also audit yourself for implicit bias by asking a friend to observe you in the real world. If you're a teacher, have people look at who you call on most in class, whatever your interactions are.
One practical thing that people should do is take stock of their friends. It would be very useful for people to actually make lists of people with whom they spend time.
Look for patterns. That's the audit. That's the assessment we can all do.
So as you're preparing to go into your groups, I want you to focus on the following discussion points. So the first, just discuss in your groups what feelings came up for you during this section of the presentation. Go a little further. Discuss what do you believe led to those feelings, whether positive or negative. And then secondly, if someone were to audit you regarding racial biases, so if someone were to audit you regarding your racial biases, what would be their assessment? What are potential areas of growth? So I'll put these in the chat and we will go ahead and break out into our rooms. I think we have majority of folks back. And once again, I was able to jump around to a couple of different rooms and being able to hear some of your discussions. And once again, just really healthy discussion. Everyone was being super vulnerable, which is so important for this process. So I'm once again just grateful that we're all sharing space together and that you all are able to talk and have these discussions, these healthy discussions, right, and being able to learn from one another in this way. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to jump into our third section of the workshop. I want to talk a little bit about, okay, Mia, we've talked about these implicit biases, we've talked about these processes, but why is that important for us as Christians? Why do we need to know about that? So like we've discussed in, like the video that we just watched mentioned, when we talk about biases, what it allows us to do most of the time, and I know a couple of people mentioned this with our first activity, that circle of trust, is what it's doing is it's creating an in-group bias a lot of the times. So what in-group bias is when you have these feelings of affinity or these feelings of closeness to a particular group that you have a strong connection to. And what research shows us is that the people that we tend to have this in-group bias with, right, this group that we feel close to, we feel connected to, we tend to trust them more. So people who fall into that category, we trust them more. We tend to hold them in a higher regard, right? Think more positively of them, give them benefit of the doubt. There's more cooperation with folks who fall into this in-group that we are a part of. And I think what's most interesting to me, especially as a Christian, is we find in the research that we have more empathy for folks who fall into this in group that we have, right? We're able to relate to them. We're able to build connection to them in a different way emotionally. So what might be, if one or two people want to respond, you can raise your hand or put it in the chat. What could be an implication of this? Yes, Stephen.
Well, the folks not in the in group become the other. And we don't empathize with them. In fact, we demonize the other because they are not like ourselves. And that can happen on an individualized level or a systemic level or societal level.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Stephen. Joanne.
Sorry. I think that as a Christian, the people that we reach out to can just be people like us if we don't recognize our implicit bias, same race, same educational background, people who are just like us.
That's a really good point. One more person, is anyone else? What could be the implications of this kind of in-group bias? Yeah, David.
Yeah, I think we had talked about trust before, and for me, trust, there's a lot that goes into trust. So if I'm in this group, I'm not doing or expending the energy or the effort or the intentionality of trusting someone else who's not in the group. So I think that's another implication, because it's just like, yeah, I see that person over there, but the amount of energy, the amount of commitment that I need to put into that new relationship to build trust, I'm not sure if I'm ready for it. So that's one of the things.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And that's absolutely right. Everything from who we reach out to, who we're trusting, how we might be treating people who are outside of that group. Those are all implications of this in-group bias. And I know I didn't get to every single hand that was raised, but I'm hoping if you're still up for it, just save your thought. And then at the end of the workshop, I do want to have some time for all of us to be able to come back together and kind of discuss some of these things. And so going back to what we've been talking about, right, this process, you've seen this image several times now. And so thinking about the stereotypes and the bias, and I'm sure by now in your groups, you've all discussed how all of us have them in many different ways. So these stereotypes, these biases can lead to prejudice, right? They can lead to these negative attitudes, and that can then lead to discriminatory behavior, right? Treating people unfairly in different ways. And so when we talk about the importance, as Christians, and I know when we prayed in the beginning, this was in the prayer. I know Blyma discussed the purpose of the SCUAD. It's central to this, right? But this idea of unity, right? That was God's plan. Jesus gave his life for us to be unified. And so if we're not recognizing the biases that we have and that we hold, then can we truly be unified with everyone? Something that I often think about is, of course, we want to be one in Christ, but as I'm sure you've all talked about, just sharing your stories, we don't all have the same experiences in the world. And so if we're not recognizing the different things in our environment that can be influencing us, can we really and truly reach that unity? You know, one of the implications that we tend to see is that othering versus connecting, right? And I know one of you mentioned this. So when we don't recognize our biases, when we don't recognize some of the stereotypes that we may hold, this can allow for us to other those who are not a part of our in-group, those that do not fall into that category. And while this can be race, we've also discussed how this can be a number of other aspects of our identity or aspects that we tend to relate to. So it's important that we're examining our interactions and feelings, right? Thinking about that process and understanding, okay, let me address and let me have a moment of interrogation when I get one of those what I call feelings, right? When I get around certain people or when I'm in certain spaces and I get that feeling, okay, well, let me interrogate that. What's happening there? Why am I feeling this way? And that's how, when we start to address those sorts of things and we start to do some of that internal work, that's how we can start building connection, right, with other folks who maybe aren't a part of our in-group. So can you think of instances in the Bible, and you can put in the chat, you can raise your hand, just one or two folks where Jesus built connection with those who had been othered? Some of you probably thinking me, right? Like Jesus built connection with me. But who else? Miriam, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, that's my wife. I'm using her.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. That you can call me Miriam. It don't bother me at all. And plus, you said her name right. Most people don't pronounce her name right. That's really good. Yeah, I was thinking of Jesus when he dealt with Mary Magdalene, who had like 7 demons, and I mean, for most people, she definitely was a other, and so she had all kind of trauma and problems, and she was definitely an other to most people, but she still had friends, I'm sure, but Jesus did really great with her.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Simone, I see your hand raised.
Yeah. I was thinking about the woman who was caught in adultery. She had obviously been living a life that had a lot of shame in it. And I mean, she was about to be really othered by everybody, othered to the point of death. But, Jesus had mercy on her and made a connection with her and didn't pile on any shame to her predicament.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example. I see Grace.
Yeah, I was thinking about the tax collector and how Jesus ate and was associated with him despite that being the thing that were frowned upon by Pharisees and Jews of the time.
Yes, I think that is probably the first example I think of. I think the scripture I'm thinking of is Mark 2, when Jesus eats with Levi and right, and the tax collectors. And then in my version of the Bible that I have, where it'll have the kind of thematic breaks, it says that Jesus ate with other, like the tax Levi and the other sinners, right? So people who have very clearly been othered within society. I also think about John 4, right? The Samaritan woman. And also think about the bleeding woman as well. Folks who people had kind of cast out to the side within society a lot of the times, right? So we can clearly see instances where Jesus reached out to folks who were not necessarily a part of maybe his in-group, but also just Christian or believers, right? During that time, believers, the in-group at that point, right? But there was still connection being built. There was still kind of taking steps to really draw those lines of connection. So what I want you all to do, if you have a Bible, when you break out into your groups, I want you to spend some time reading through Galatians 2:11-20. I'll also put that scripture in the chat, or that passage in the chat. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and do that now while I'm thinking. Well, I'll do it once I finish talking while I think of it. But read through Galatians 2:11-20 as a group. And I really want you to focus on verses 11-13 and discuss the following. How does this relate to our larger conversation of implicit biases? In what ways do you see yourself in this passage? And then 3, what can be learned from Paul's response? So, like I said, I'm going to place this scripture in the chat. And when you read it, in this passage, I'm sure we're all familiar with it. Peter and Paul were meeting with several believers, both Jewish and Gentile. But Peter was treating the Jewish believers quite differently than he was everyone else. And Paul rebukes him for it, right? So focus on these 3 discussion points, and then we'll come back as a group and discuss. And I was able to jump around to a couple of different discussion groups and able to hear you all really wrestling with that scripture and, its implication for your own lives. And also I know a couple of people stated how they were pretty impressed with Paul's response, right? And the seriousness in which he took the matter, right? And I think that's something that it seems like from at least the groups that I was a part of is something that really resonated with everyone, but also something that really influenced and impacted everyone as well. And so we have talked about a lot today. It is 1:36. We started at 11. We've talked about a lot. And so let's all just take a moment, right? Take a moment, take a couple of deep breaths, gather our thoughts, and really just kind of think about some of the things that we've talked about here today. And it relates to bias and implicit bias and the different implications that can have in our lives. And so, of course, we know that a 3-hour workshop is not going to be the solution for these matters by any means, but it is a starting point, right? And what I'm hoping once this workshop is over, that you'll kind of take some of the following things to consider. That you'll be thinking about, the education aspect of it. So how are you going to work to understand your own biases from this point forward? Think about the empathy, right? Empathizing with other people. How will you ensure that you're listening to others outside of your in-group, right? And that you're building connection. And then how are you going to be engaging with other folks? So think of ways that you can start engaging with the takeaways from this time. Right? Think of the ways that you can start to engage, action-oriented items that you can take away from your time here today. And so what I want to do for the next 20 minutes or so is I'm going to stop sharing, and I'd really like it if some folks can maybe share something that they took away from today. How did you feel when you were going through this workshop? And if you want to discuss an aha moment that you had, right, during our time today, or even just discuss how this workshop, was beneficial for you as a Christian. Like, what do you see is the importance of this as you continue your walk with God? So if a few folks want to raise their hands, and we can just kind of start from there. I see Byron has his hand raised.
Yeah, thanks. One thing that occurs to me is just sometimes how hard it is to really understand my own biases and stuff. And that last thing about how do we see ourselves in Peter's predicament, I guess, verse 12 and 13. And what it just occurred to me, just sitting here thinking about it, that, you know, as a old white male, you know, that's my group. And you know how, you know, our climate in this country, you know, and how there's actions and reactions. You know, people say Black Lives Matter, and then my group comes back with, no, all lives matter, you know, sort of, you know, and that kind of thing. And you know, I'm sitting here thinking about, all right, my in group, you know, and then Peter's reaction. And I'm sitting here thinking, you know, it's, you know, as old white men, you know, we now are the new embattled group. You know, we're being confronted now with what we have built for 200 years of, you know, discrimination, et cetera. And there's a tendency, as we've seen, to be very defensive, and you know, and so, you know, one of the temptations in my in group is just to kind of draw in and commiserate, you know, with the sentiment that, hey, there's way too many grievances being expressed. You know, what is, you know, get off my back. And, you know, it's, yeah, and there's I got to see, yeah, there really is a tendency for me to kind of empathize with that thought that, you know, come on, leave us alone. And, you know, and that's a challenge to break out of that. And I don't even think I see all the ways that I do that, but I know it's there. So anyway, that's something I learned.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Byron. And right, that's kind of something that we've been talking about throughout this time, is that is the difficulty with our biases, these implicit biases, is they're really hard to put a finger on sometimes. And we do have to do a lot of internal work, a lot of interrogation about the feelings that come up, you know, in certain situations. And, oh, why am I feeling like this? What's happening, right? Like, why am I thinking like this in this particular situation? So those are really great points. I saw someone physically raise their hand. Rick?
Yeah, it made me think how, you know, dealing with the subconscious and the conscious, and you know, I've had different experiences than everyone. You know, everyone is like a snowflake. You know, we've all had different experiences. So all I know is mine. And so I like this class because it helps me try to think through other people and see what other people are thinking, you know. But it did bring up a lot of angry thoughts. You know, I went to an all-Black college, and the instructor, I was the only white male in the class, and he didn't even open the book the whole semester. All he talked about was how bad white people were and how great Black people were. And I worked in Southeast DC for 11 years, and I was the only white guy 99% of the time. And so the way I survived was the way a lot of probably African Americans over time have survived. I hung around foreigners and African Americans who went to church, who didn't hate me. And so, you know, different things, you know, it tends to make me feel a little emotional and angry when I hear some things, but you know, I have to deal with me. So that's some of the things I think about.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And you know, that's one of the things that's so important about, well, I think life in general, but this particular workshop, right, when we talked about in the beginning about embracing those different feelings that come up for us and not running from them, and really trying to pinpoint, you know, what's the root of that? Where is this coming from? And, you know, how do I move forward from that? So I appreciate you sharing that. I think Constance had her hand raised. Okay.
Yeah, you know, I did not know what to expect at all. And it really makes you think. You know, when you're a Christian for a long time, some things you minimize some of those biases because of the scriptures, you know, about being all things to all men, about, you know, we've been around a long time. We've always had people in our home. We've always reached out to a lot of people. We've always been a multicultural environment, you know, so you don't really think about them on a large scale. But I had to really go back to some of the small scale things that happened to me that are biases that I minimize because of being a disciple for 30 something years. So yeah, it was really good. It was really enlightening. It helped me to think about, like when I was interviewing for seamstress position or apprenticeship and being rejected by certain cultures because I was a Black woman, and a lot of alterations and all that are strong in other cultures, and for them to not want to help me be a seamstress or me to be an apprentice for them, I minimized that. But it helped me to realize, okay, that's something that I have to deal with now as a seamstress when customers come to me from different cultures, how I respond to them and wanting to serve them. And that I have, like, I don't want to work with this culture because of this. I don't want to work with that culture because of that. And it's putting me in a place where I have to deal with those biases. So that's my takeaway.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing that. And that's, I mean, you're 100% right. It's very easy for us, myself obviously is included in this, to minimize certain experiences or, kind of say like, oh, maybe this isn't that big of a deal and kind of brush it off. But we do have to sit with things and, like you said, really pinpoint, okay, how is this thing that I'm trying to make seem small, how could this impact me in different ways? And like you said, I just think you worded it so eloquently, but just making sure that you're being mindful when it comes to, working with other cultures and things like that. So you're 100% right. And I appreciate you sharing that. And Layman has his hand up, and then we'll go to Jerry.
Yeah. First of all, I just want to say that I do empathize actually with my white brothers and white sisters in Christ, and I also do empathize as well too with our white fathers in Christ, because I know that I do know that most of them are actually making every effort, you know, to do what is right. Um and also I will actually make every effort to examine myself, to examine, my own biases, which of course I believe that everybody does have some type of bias, yeah nobody is immune. Yeah and I feel like that's something I'll be we're working on constantly. However, I also want to say that the church should be the safest place for us to express ourselves. Not of course outwardly, but through sessions like these. And I feel the truth is the hardest thing to hear. There's no easy way to say it, and there's no easy way to hear it. And I feel if we actually hold on to it and express it through discussions like these, I feel it will help both sides, not just me, but it will help everyone to come to be aware exactly of what each other is going through, and that way we will be able to better empathize with each other and know exactly how to treat each other, because I feel that love can only exist, let's say if I tell you how I feel, and if you tell me how I feel, then we know exactly what to do, how to behave towards each other. Of course it will not be easy to hear, but if we do embrace it, as ugly as it might seem, but I feel it will help all sides to know exactly how to better empathize, with everybody else of like different races, you know. There were like discussions like these, you know. Yeah. So I would really, like I really do enjoy discussions like this, and I hope that it does continue. And I just want to say like like we should not shy away from discussions like these, because it's like I feel like these are times to actually like these are like times for us to like express ourselves, like to say that what we are going through, you know.
Absolutely. No, Layman, I mean, yeah, you're spot on. And I want to give some time for a couple of other people to share, but I do want to thank you so much for sharing that. And like we said, right, that's how we build connection. And that's what's so important about this co-learning environment, is because we do build connection from learning from each other, from our stories, from our backgrounds, from things that influence us. So that's really important. I appreciate you sharing that. Jerry, and then we can go to Mary.
Okay. Yeah, I think one thing that I really took away from this was listening to people who have expressed hurt from bias. And it's deep, it's a lot, and for anyone, and I shared too that I had felt some things, and but to be able to put yourself in a person's place who's experienced unfair treatment, and the hurt that comes from it is empathy, and it's the weapon that we have to destroy bias, is empathy. And the next thing that I really took away from it was Paul's response, and I shared it in our small group, but I loved it that the first thing he said was, I opposed Peter because he stood condemned, and then and I think it's a lesson for all of us, when not to be quiet. Just if somebody's being left out, or if somebody's being treated poorly or unfairly or unjustly, and it's witnessed, it's just, it will lead people astray. It'll lead people astray if something isn't done, if you don't speak out about it. And I think that's an area of where I need to repent, and be more bold, and not shy away from things that I see that are affecting people, because those things have ripples and waves, and they grow, and they like that 11 through 13 was just a perfectly constructed piece of work to show what happens when bias, that people get led astray, and we just cannot do that. And so I'm kind of emotional about it right now, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I have things I want to say, but I just saw another hand raised. So, but I appreciate you sharing that, and that important point. I will say that important point about listening, just learning to listen to others, and the power that even that can hold. So, we'll go to Mary, and then Simone, and then Grace, and depending on time, we might have to stop there.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Maya, for this conversation, the SCUAD team for putting this together and just opening this conversation that's so critical. I think, and not to minimize any one of our experiences, because they're all real, but I think a takeaway for me is sometimes life is not always what we really think it is. Our biases, I think for me, my biases will only limit me, was a takeaway. And it's so much easier for me to withdraw my heart when I don't understand, or when I see things that I don't necessarily agree with. And it takes something as a disciple to choose to live and embrace others the way Jesus did. It's the only thing that brings freedom. And I think that's what I'm left with. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And Simone?
Yeah, I definitely wanted to say thank you. Is it Mia or Maya?
It's Mia.
Mia. Thank you so much, Mia, just for bringing us all together for this time to really learn and grow with one another and confront some things that I think typically we want to avoid because it feels a lot safer to stay in our biases than it does to actually expose them. But yeah, I think a couple things really stood out to me today. And it was one, like towards the end, I mean, so much stood out to me, but one towards the end where you talked about how Jesus treated marginalized people. And then two, in my group, a comment Leroy made about how Jesus was marginalized himself. And it just so completely like brought it back into perspective about how like Jesus was an outsider to everybody. And he also made everybody feel like they were on the inside. And I think like that's the call that I really want to walk away with myself, even as we're looking at how to be more like Jesus, to be willing to treat the outside like they are the inside, and to really be okay, even if we end up in a situation where, like, if Peter's situation had worked out differently and he had not chosen hypocrisy in the moment, he would have been potentially left out by that insider group. And I think it's that call to be willing to be put outside ourselves for the sake of bringing other people in. So yeah, I just really appreciate this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Simone. I love what you said about, how Jesus made outsiders feel like they were on the inside. I've never really thought like of course we know, we talked about that is exactly what Jesus did, but you just put it in a very eloquent, like succinct, way. So yeah, so I appreciate you sharing that. And I think we will end it out on Grace.
She says Grace, I think she's.
Hi, Mia. Thank you so much again for just, leading this workshop. It's definitely been eye-opening in a lot of ways. I think, this, I hope, this is, like we continue to have more workshop like this where we can kind of talk with one another, but also, like be aware of our own, biases and sometimes even prejudice as well. I know, like, during this entire, workshop, I got to hear from my brothers and sisters that about their own life and their own thoughts, and they got to be very vulnerable and open, and it really has opened my eyes a lot to really just understand and like just to know them better. It felt like family. We don't have the same background, we don't have the same experience, but being able to just bring all those differences together and even share and be accepted for whatever, it really does kind of it felt like, oh, this is church, this is what I can see Christ in like being happy where it's just like, this is what I want, you know, as my, like, this is my family. And I definitely, you know, like want us to just, you know, continue in that. And I know it's gonna, you know, like it takes more communication and, you know, areas in which I also need to grow in, and just listening and not like make an assumption, but really just having that vulnerability to also share and open up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Grace, for sharing that. And yeah, like we've said, there is so much power in vulnerability and in listening and in these times. And also to your point, also kind of meditating a little bit and thinking about the things that we do after this time, right? How are we going to put some of these things that we're learning into practice? So as Desreen pointed out in the chat, I think it is a great way, both literally and figuratively, to end on grace, right? So we're going to end the workshop there, but I'm so grateful to everyone at the Capitol Rivers Church, the leadership, all of you for having me, Brahma and Desreen for you know, recruiting me, bringing me in. So this was a really great workshop. I appreciate everyone's vulnerability and the sharing and the communication and just the space, really the community, the family that you all built. So yeah, thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Mia. I know we're at the top of the hour, and I just wanted to say thank you to all of you who took the time out on Saturday to spend 3 hours with us. I know it's challenging and busy environment, but we want to thank you. Mia, I just said, every time I think about you, you remind me of what Paul said to the Ephesians. He says, so Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, the teachers to equip his people for works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of fullness. I think you have been given a gift, and I'm so grateful and thankful to you that you're using that gift to help mature God's people. And we thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Some of the takeaways for me is that, you know, we're not born with bias. We learn it. And so if we can learn it, then we can unlearn it. But it's not as easy to do so. It takes intentionality to educate ourselves to even understand our own biases. But more importantly, like Peter needed Paul to help him become even more aware of his own prejudice, that we all need each other here in this community if we are going to be able to work on and improve and even understand our biases, let alone try to overcome it. So I do thank you all for joining us. And once again, there's more to come. And I thank you on behalf of the Capitol Rivers SCUAD. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Mia, you can hang around. Rami, you can hang around. Thanks so much, everyone.
We'll hang back for sure.
Thank you.